Trump threatens to leave the country if he loses to Biden. I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message. Weird way to spell flee. That's such a fun way to say flee to avoid criminal prosecution. Is his fleeing the country not a huge security risk? I mean, not to make intelligence jokes, but he gotten know some valuable info that could easily be compromised, right? Am I correct that if he remains in the US he is guaranteed some form of government security as a former president? Do they follow him if he decides to live abroad? Stop. Don't. Come back. Don the Khan is looking for a host nation that has no extradition treaty with the U.S. I love America, but I'll turn my back on it in a second. A swipe. Dictators always flee the country when they get ousted. If they don't, they end up in prison or dead. In all seriousness, I feel better that Trump feels like he has an out and he doesn't have to cling to power at all costs. He's so narcissistic that he would willingly cause mass destruction just to save his own old ass. No way Trump gets out of the country. The intelligence community cannot have a former president getting picked up by a hostile party. Even if it's under bad terms, they are not letting him leave. You really are trapped in here with us, you dunce. Yeah, cause he loses. Not because he'll be going straight to jail, just because he loses. LOL. They'll just extradite him probably, he owes a lot of money. Can New York pull his passport as a flight risk? Haha, okay, who had absconded to Russia on their bingo card? Literally everybody. Sometime in the last 24 hours I pictured in my mind Joe Biden's inauguration ceremony with empty chairs where Trump would have sat. We will move forward without him, and I can only hope that Twitter closes his account forever. Bye Felicia. There it is. This is him signaling that he's a flight risk because he knows he'll end up in prison for the rest of his life once he's out of office. Imagine being the supporter of a president who says that if he loses an election he'll leave the country. The president's love of the country hinges solely on his supporters' level of admiration. Next, he's going to tell them to go out and show how much they love him for the next 3 weeks. This was the greatest Trump defecting to Russia scenario I ever read. https://www. reddit.com/r/politics/comment/amy4/donald_Trump_jr_will_by_Mueller/of Because he knows he'll end up in jail. When danger reared its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled to a country with no extradition treaty with US. Oh no. How terrible. Don't do that, anything but that. Also he will and land in Moscow. He will go to Russia. It's not even a question. And this would also greatly benefit Putin. Put yourself in his shoes. If your goal is to continue the attack on the US, further create chaos, drive the political divide, stir unrest, this could easily be accomplished by openly supporting Trump, provide refuge for Trump, and claim the US legal system mistreated him, that the US government is corrupt, and he was cheated. Trump voters/conservatives would lose further faith in the US government and systems, further radicalize them, and would find sympathy with Trump and view Putin more positively. Trump, being the easily manipulated useful idiot that he is, would 100% go along with this. Plus he wants to avoid financial ruin and prison. So he really has no choice. The icing on the cake will be the hard intelligence/national security secrets Trump would hand over. Despite him not really paying attention to intelligence reports or briefings, he still would certainly possess some level of classified/sensitive information about various things: US military readiness, national security, intelligence apparatus to some degree. You don't get a better asset than a former US president. Putin/Russia would absolutely love to have this information, and Trump would happily exchange it over for assurances of his freedom, resources, money, etc. Hell, Trump may even direct some of his staff, who flee with him, to gather more stuff to hand over. Odds are Putin is whispering this stuff into his ears right now, priming him to do so. The precedent has already been set as well. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and remains there now, when he was repudiated by Ukraine voters in 2014. I thought he might need to do that anyway. And now he's laying the groundwork. You can't threaten me with a good time. LOL, isn't this what conservatives love to make fun of liberals for saying? But he said it about himself? LMAO. Music to my fucking ears. Feel the fear, Mr. President. It takes a worried man to sing a worried song. Any nation he flees to would have to know that when America sends people across our borders, they're not sending their best. Let him run. We all knew that's what it would come down to, anyway. Let him have all his assets seized. Let him live a few months on the run from US prosecutors, the International Court of Justice and Russian loan sharks. Let him live out his last weeks looking over his shoulder in constant fear of capture. Let him be found living out his last few days of freedom in a fucking hole in the ground covered in his own piss and shit, just like Saddam Hussein. It's the only fitting end to this terrible chapter in our shared story. I think he'll be on the first plane to Moscow. Cool. Please take your supporters with you. Yet another good reason to vote. Seriously though. Trump will likely find the list of countries that will accept him fairly short, and it better be one without an extradition treaty. He'll be a liability, not an asset, once he's no longer in office to any country. What little we know about his finances seems to show that he's underwater too, so he'll have to scrape to buy his way in. Flee to Russia. Mr. Vice President, what will your first words be to Donald Trump if you win the election? Joe Biden, don't leave town. I'll buy his ticket. I know he's broke as fuck, so the least I could do is help him be a problem elsewhere. Wow, he really is afraid of going to prison. So, he just declared himself to be a flight risk, right? No bail for Lil Donnie. If Trump loses, he will literally be in bed with Putin, but if he loses, I think the Secret Service will not allow him to leave. He will probably be arrested as Biden is taking the oath of office. If he resigns, they will probably arrest him at that point. If it were to happen that way, Trump will finally have the highest ratings on TV that he desperately wants showing his arrest. And his supporters will say it's not because he's fleeing charges. They'll insist he's afraid of Biden using the DOJ to go after him, with no hint of the deep and complex feelings of shame they should be feeling at that moment. As a Canadian, we politely decline his presence here. Could you imagine if I lose? My whole life, what am I going to do? I'm going to say, I lost to the worst candidate in the history of politics. I'm not going to feel so good. Maybe I'll have to leave the country, I don't know. Can't keep a secret, this idiot. Thank you. Slightly updating an old copy pasta because it seems relevant here. The original was deleted, but you can find various versions of the original flooding around at this time last year. I really hope this all ends with him arranging a summit with Putin in Moscow as a ruse for him to defect during his last months in office. That way it will be really hard for anyone to not reconcile with the fact that he is a self-interested coward. Imagine Trump in Russia. For the first couple of months it's the biggest story in the world. He does interviews on Russian state TV, talking about how the deep state caused him to flee the country. Insisting he's still the president and he never really lost the election. But then, slowly but as sure as the changing tide, fewer journalists are calling. Fewer requests for an interview. For a couple months he can still call up reporters and have what he says to them be newsworthy, but eventually they stop returning his calls. America and the world has moved on. He was a blip, a flash in the pan. He exposed deep wounds that the American people need to address. But he was a complication, not the original infection. No one really wants to know what he has to say anymore. Because no one cares. He's now truly alone. In reality, he has always been alone. He just hadn't realized it. Now he has regular contact with no one but his FSB bodyguards/handlers. He's stuck in a golden prison of his own making. He lives next to Yanukovych. But Viktor, being Ukrainian, knows the culture and the language. Trump is never able to master anything but the ability to mumble some words that border on the incomprehensible in the language. His days are spent in an unexceptional, in his eyes, dacha on the Black Sea. He's never far from the ever-present sight of Russian security services. He lives off a modest Kremlin-funded stipend, but domestic pressure is building on the United Russia Party to scale it back. He has no income of his own anymore. His assets are frozen and seized around the world, his children are indicted. He didn't tell them of his plans to flee beforehand and they were as surprised as anyone. But, perhaps for the first time in their lives, Ivanka, Don Jr. and Eric feel the curious absence of a pressure they can't explain. At first they can't figure it out, they each face years in prison yet they have never felt more free. They confide in each other and they soon realize that the weight lifted from their souls is that of their father. Free from his domineering presence they all plead to lesser charges. Putting the blame squarely on the narcissistic father whose Stockholm Syndrome-like grip on them is slipping, they are sentenced. Don Jr. gets 18 months in federal prison. Ivanka and Jared are sentenced to staggered 12-month sentences. Eric cooperates fully and is not charged. They are forbidden from contacting their father as part of their plea agreements. But they have no such desires, they don't care. Melania files for divorce almost immediately after his flight. She gains full custody of Baron in uncontested hearings. Her and her son are slowly spending more and more time in Slovenia. Eventually they relocate permanently. Melania and Baron split their time between Ljubljana and the French Riviera, very sparingly visiting the States anymore. Her autobiography detailing the mental, emotional, and at times physical abuse she suffered becomes an international bestseller. Trump's American passport has long since been revoked and the Slovene government, as well as the EU, bans him from entry into the Schengen area. He never sees, much less talks to them, again. Trump becomes increasingly paranoid. He frequently tears his dacha apart looking for listening devices planted by Mossad, the Democrats, CIA, MI6 or whatever globalist conspiracy is hunting him this week. Soon he has no use for the teenage sex workers he has always fancied. Never having been a drinker, food becomes his only vice. He begins to put on weight. A lot of weight. As he slips into morbid obesity he nears 355 pounds. He very often rants and raves at his bodyguards, his tenuous grip on reality is slipping. Some days he doesn't seem to know where he is. He is borderline catatonic on occasion. Spending days in his bedroom suite without leaving, only to eventually emerge in a fresh, albeit cheap and ill-fitting, suit. His wispy hair, long kept alive by the marvels of modern hair care technology, perfectly coiffed. During these fleeting moments of seeming sanity, he doesn't seem to remember much of the last decades, believing himself to still be a pompous fixture of the New York real estate scene. He once even asked his handlers how the New Jersey Generals were faring this season. But within 2 or 3 days he is once again disheveled and ranting about the deep state, his speech becoming more slurred and incomprehensible by the year. A series of strokes leaves his body partially paralyzed on one side. He now requires round-the-clock nursing. Incontinence soon follows. Eventually he's found on the floor of his dacha, face down in a puddle of his own vomit. He is discovered by the morning nurse as she begins her shift. His breathing is slow, his heart rate is faint. He never again regains consciousness. He looks to have collapsed at some point in the night. During a mad, partially paralyzed slog to the bathroom in a vain attempt to avoid soiling his bed once again. The official cause of death is a heart attack. Which is likely true, but having outlived his usefulness, the Russian government has long since seen him as an embarrassing liability. His asylum has been a sticking point in relations with the West for years, and conspiracy theories alleging his assassination at the hands of the FSB or CIA abound. The Russians offer to repatriate his remains. Although his family, while not outright refusing, is lukewarm to the prospect. They have moved on. Baron and Tiffany don't even use his surname anymore. Unable to find a solution, the Russians bury him in a modest grave. It was originally planned to be temporary, but a long-term solution never comes to fruition. Before too long everyone has forgotten. In death he remains infamous, his name uttered in the same breath as other embarrassing episodes of American history. Some infinite presidents are recognized for the disasters they got us into, like the Iraq War and the Vietnam War, but Trump managed to kill far more Americans than that by simple incompetence. 250,000 people died as a result of his ego, and then close to that many died the following year while the country worked to sort out the mess he left behind and get the virus under control. In U.S. history textbooks he is relegated to a few paragraphs, not more than half a page in the section on politics. In fact, he has mentioned far more in the discussion of disasters that hit the United States than on any sort of political achievements, because he didn't actually achieve anything, he simply failed to act based on his own arrogance. And that's all he's remembered for. He's brought up in conjunction with a wider discussion on the political gridlock of the late 2000s, 2010s, and early 20s. In the end, he is nothing more than the answer to a few multiple-choice questions on an 11th grade history final. His legacy once seemed destined to be that of a pompous, arrogant game show host and real estate fraudster. Nothing but a textbook example of that which one would describe as tacky. Now he is simply, what was the name of the president attributed to the largest preventable disaster in American history? The answer is, C. Donald J. Trump.